Well, good morning, all. Appreciate folks joining us on a Saturday, and it's kind of gray and gloomy out here in LA. I'm not sure how it is in the rest of the world, but at least we're not getting tornadoes and things like that, like I see in St. Louis. So we have a guest speaker today, one of our very own that's here almost every week, Mr. Brock Thurman. So, Brock,
Oh,
let me make you a co-host here. Do you feel the power, the impressive, forces that reign in you now?
I just hope I don't fumble this too badly.
Oh, you've done fine on the practice run, so I think
Okay.
you do just fine. But wait, the
All
view
right.
behind me's changed. You've moved your camera a little. I'm not used to that.
Yeah, I decided I was off to one side so much, so I changed the camera view because I'll be on this side reading the script. So anyway, shall I go ahead and share the
Yeah.
screen? Okay, I'm going to do that. And that's it right there. And share. You all see that image now?
Yes,
Yep.
indeed.
Okay. And that's over there to the side, so that's good. A couple of comments in advance. I'm going to ask that nobody make any comments or questions during the presentation. There's a lot of information here, and I could get lost a little bit if that happens. So what I would suggest is either using keyword, like a keyword thing, you can put it into the uh, chat that when we see the keyword, we'll ask, well, what's this question about, rather than taking a bunch of time to type out a question and you'll miss part of the presentation, or just simply jot down a note in front of you on a piece of paper that just says, I want to ask this, just again, a keyword. So just a thought there, just to make it easier for everybody. And so you're not taking stuff. I'm assuming there might be questions. There may not be any questions at all. Uh, But anyway, other than that, I will get going. If I pause every now and then, it's probably to take a sip of water. I don't know how I'll do with an hour's worth of presentation, continually talking. I'm not sure how my throat's going to do, but we'll see what happens. So this is a presentation. This came out of a document that I quickly put together when I realized that the very first commemorative stamps that were issued by the United States were for a world exposition. And so I started looking into it some more and wrote what at that time was a relatively simple paper and sent it off to Bill because I thought he'd enjoy seeing that information. I knew he's collected stamps and everything. Then I expanded it some, added some pictures to it, and sent that off to him and said, what do you think about using this as a presentation? And then this version of it is expanded even further because as I got into it, I fell into several rabbit holes that led me into things that I didn't know before and thought would be interesting to add to this. And in this case of some of the stories I had in the original document, turned out to be one version of the story that was not necessarily the right version. So anyway, that's where we got to where we are today. So without any further ado here, I'm going to get started on this. So the first National Postal Agency was created on July 26, 1775 by the Second Continental Congress and was known as the United States Post Office. Oops, that didn't work. Hang on. I think I might have hit my document. There we go. All right. Benjamin Franklin was appointed as its first postmaster general. Department, that is, was renamed the United States Postal Department in 1792 with the passage of the Postal Service Act by the United States Congress. And again in 1970 with the signing of the Postal Reorganization Act, it became what we know today as the United States Postal Service, or USPS. The Postal Department did not start issuing postal stamps till 1847, when on July 1st, the two postage stamps issued were released with the likenesses of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington on the 5 and 10-cent stamps. These stamps were known as definitive stamps, which were the only type of stamp issued for the next 46 years. The relationship between the United States Postal Department and the World or National Exposition started in 1893 with the release of the first commemorative stamps by the Postal Department for the Columbian issues, celebrating the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Originally considered, oh boy, I'm stumbling here. Hang on. Illinois. Originally consisted of 15 different stamps issued in varying values from 1 cent to $5. Shortly after these stamps were released in January 1893, a newly introduced lower rate fee for registered mail of 8 cents required the issuance of a 16th stamp with that value. For the next 16 years until 1909, the only commemorative stamps issued by the Postal Department were associated with expositions. The Columbian issues were the brainchild of Postmaster General John Wanamaker, who saw opportunity in Chicago's proposed gala affair. And announced in his intention to issue the series in 1892 address to Congress. A consideration other than commemorating Columbus inspired Wanamaker, however. The series would raise revenues for the Postal Department by appealing to collectors, some of whom would never use the stamps for services. As such, they would be souvenir stamps. Further, the series would include expensive denominations not tied to valid postal rates. Collectors purchasing the stamps would in essence provide the Postal Department with monies it never needed to repay in service. Those who purchased paid the entire set paid dearly, $16.34. That is $558 in today's money.
Wow.
At that time, when laborers earned between $400 and $500 per year, adjusted for inflation, that's $13,500 and $17,000 today, few could justify such an investment. Nonetheless, the single low denomination stamps proved very popular with the public, which had thoroughly embraced the new collecting mania. In total, 2,013,972,550 stamps were printed in varying amounts between all 16 stamp denominations and distributed for sale with a face value of over $40 million. That's then. So that was a lot more. Now, the 2-cent stamp was the first class rate at the time. So over 72% of that total, which is like just under 1.5 billion stamps, were distributed for that denomination alone. While exact sales figures were not kept, it is believed that sales ultimately generated nearly $40 million, so almost all of them were sold, which is equivalent to $1.3 billion today. So it was a very successful release of stamps. This issue was produced and printed by the American Banknote Company for the Postal Department, which was one of several printing companies that had been printing stamps for the department during the first 46 years of issuing stamps. In this series, there were 2 minor collecting varieties that occurred. One, in the 2-cent stamp, seen here on the left, was a plate flaw which caused a notch to occur in the brim of a hat of the third sailor to Columbus's right. It is known as the broken hat variety and fairly common. The second variation occurred during one of the print runs of the 4-cent stamp when a pressman accidentally used the wrong color ink. The original color was ultramarine, which is the top stamp on this picture on the right, and the miscolored stamp was printed in blue at the bottom on that right side. The error was discovered during quality control inspections, but a few of these stamps were missed and were released and sold to the public. Thus, the stamp is rarer and much more valuable, worth between $17,500 and $32,500, depending on condition of the stamp, as compared to the $50 to $140 for the correct color today. One other interesting fact about these stamps is that the use of Queen Isabella's image on the $4 stamp was the first time the likeness of a woman's face was adorned a U.S. postage stamp. The next time a woman's face would grace a U.S. postage stamp was 9 years later, when Martha Washington's likeness appeared on the 8-cent stamp in the 1902 and 1903 definitive series issue. The Postal Department also released 4 pre-printed postal envelopes with this issue. The image featured an American eagle, Christopher Columbus, and Lady Liberty. The embossed stamped image was done in 4 different colors: deep blue, violet, chocolate, and slate brown, with 4 different postal rates: 1, 2, 5, and 10 cents. The beautiful, highly collectible Columbian stamps were on sale for only 15 months, between January 2nd, 1893 and April 12th, 1894, except for the dollar value stamps, which remained on sale. All of these stamps also proved to be an incredibly ingenious marketing device for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition, as their sales and use repeatedly drew the public's attention to the fair. However, many businessmen and some of the public disliked the stamps for their large size, twice the size of the normal definitive stamps, which had been used since the Postal Department began printing stamps in 1847. But the Postal Department soon used the stamp size format again, which would become the standard for most commemorative stamps in the future. Besides the 1893 Columbian issue, the only other commemorative stamps issued during the 19th century came about when Edward Rosewater, publisher of the Omaha Daily Bee, convinced Postmaster General James A. Gary to issue a set of 9 stamps with values from 1 cent to $2 to commemorate the 1898 Trans-Mississippi Exposition being held in Omaha, Nebraska, to promote the development of the Midwest and West. Surprisingly, the designs of these Trans-Mississippi stamps have no explicit connection to the exposition. Unlike the Columbians, they don't bear dates, and the illustrations on each stamp bear only the caption of the paintings, sketches, or photograph used for the design, without obvious relationship to the other stamps or the exposition itself. The Trans-Mississippi stamps were also the first commemorative stamps to be produced and printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, or the BEP, and were originally to be printed in 2 colors, the borders in various colors and the center vignettes in black. Unfortunately, due to printing requirements associated with the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, the Bureau found it would be unable to furnish satisfactorily or in the time desired supplies of several denominations in 2 colors. So the stamps were produced in a variety of single colors, as you can see here. The $1 and $2 values never had the sales to collectors that were anticipated. Ironically, those stamps which were on sale from June 17th through December 31st of 1898 were available to the public at the same time that the 1893 dollar value Columbians, which were much more popular, were still available from the Washington, D.C. post office. Another interesting fact is that it had been established early on by the Postal Department that the likeness of no living person would be featured on a postage stamp. The 2-cent Farming in the West stamp was based on an actual photograph of farm workers working the fields in North Dakota. And as such, the men working in the field could be identified and were still living at the time the stamps were released. They therefore became the first living persons depicted on a U.S. postage stamp. Another interesting thing about this, if you can see, there's a gentleman sitting on a plow where my arrow is pointing right now. His hand is up holding his hat because just before the picture was snapped, a gust of wind came up and he grabbed his hat to keep it from blowing off his head. And as a result, his face never showed on the stamp, versus the guy sitting across from him on another plow with a dog. You can see him in the stamp picture down here. So just an interesting note that this is the first time for living people. And one of the guys never had a chance to say, "That's me." I mean, you could say it was him, but you couldn't see him. Though it took 100 years, the U.S. Postal Service eventually released the Trans-Mississippi stamps in 2 colors as originally intended. This will be discussed later in the presentation. The first commemoratives for the 20th century were also the first bicolored postal stamps printed by the BEP, 6 stamps in denominations of 1, 2, 4, 5, 8, and 10 cents were issued to commemorate the 1901 Pan American Exposition held in Buffalo, New York. The stamps depict modes of modern transportation and were to bear the inscription 1901 Pan American Exposition. But the U.S. Attorney General decided it would be advertising for the fair, which was against Postal Service rules and not permitted on postage stamps. So the final stamps bore the inscription Commemorative Series 1901. In this issue of the stamp designs were two colors of each stamp, color for each stamp, a colored surround and a black vignette in the center, as had been planned for the Trans-Mississippi issue. This required two separate passes through the printing presses, one for each color. Of the 6 stamps, 2 significant errors occurred in the 1 cent and 2 cent stamps, as a number of sheets of each were printed in with the black center image inverted. These errors were missed by quality control inspections and were released for distribution and sold to the public. There is, in fact, a third inverted stamp in this issue, of which there are several stories about how the third invert occurred, including one story which stated that after an erroneous report that the same error had been discovered by the public in the 4-cent stamps, the Postal Department and Bureau intentionally printed several sheets of the 4-cent invert stamps and released them to the public in an effort to deliberately devalue the original find. If that were true, why did the BEP not print more copies of the original 2 errors on the 1 and 2 cent stamps to also devalue them? Another story states that the BEP printed the 4-cent inverts and released them for sale on purpose and was also planning to print and release inverted copies of the 5, 8, and 10 cent stamps for issue, but scrapped the project when public outcry of illegal stamp market manipulation occurred. This also does not make much sense. The story I find most plausible states that, and is more supported by evidence, that the 4-cent invert was printed deliberately as a result of a misunderstanding and in fact never went on sale to the public. After the discovery of the 1 and 2 cent inverts in mid-1901, there was a rumored discovery of an inverted stamps in the 4-cent issue. The third assistant postmaster, Edwin C. Madden, decided to track down any additional errors and in late summer had his assistant send a letter to the BEP requesting them to send any inverted Pan American stamps in their inventory to Madden's office. No inverted stamps, in fact, remained on hand, and proper procedure would have been for the Bureau to inform Madden that none of these were in stock. However, interpreting Madden's communique as an unconditional demand for inverts, and because the supposed discovery of the 4-cent issue, the Bureau produced 4 sheets of 100 stamps each of off the 4-cent plates and sent them to Madden's office. The word specimen was then hand stamped in purple ink on about half the stamps. Between 1901 and 1904, Madden distributed 172 of the 4-cent inverts, with and without the overstamps, as gifts to friends, associates, and his sons, also keeping one for himself. And you can see in these here, the 2 stamps on the right, inverted stamps, have the word specimen stamped on them, which, is supported by this story. When news of this got out, it led to charges of impropriety, and an official investigation by the Postmaster General was taken up. But Madden was cleared of any wrongdoing, given that no money had changed hands. Of the copies that remained, a pane of 100 went into the government collection of American stamps in the Washington National Museum, where a curator then later traded 97 inverts from that pane to stamp dealers in exchange for examples of rare U.S. issues missing from the museum's collection. According to records, the remaining stamps were destroyed. Less than 200 of the 4-cent stamps are accounted for today, as compared to 200 plus of the 2-cent inverts and 700 of the 1-cent inverts, which were sold to the public. The story is supported by the fact that the 4-cent invert stamps are the scarcest of the 3 issues, and that many of the 4-cent inverts have the word specimen stamped on them, as described in this story. Also, none of the other stories mentioned the overstamping at all. Also, many of the details and the names given both support that story and are on record, along with making more sense than some of the other stories. As with the Trans-Mississippi issue, these 3 inverts from this issue were also reprinted and issued in 2001 as a commemorative souvenir sheet. At this point, we're going to take a little side trip on some interesting information about U.S. invert stamps. The first time the Postal Service attempted to print 2-color stamps was part of an issue of 1869, or what is referred to as the pictorial issues. This issue of definitive stamps, there were 10 different stamp designs and 4 of them using 2 colors. Of these 4, 3 ended up with one of the colors inverted. The 15-cent Landing of Columbus, the 24-cent Declaration of Independence, and the 30-cent Shield, Eagle, and Flags were the ones that were obviously, as you can see in this picture, inverted. Only the 90-cent Lincoln did not have an invert mistake. These stamps were printed by the National Banknote Company for the Postal Department. The next time the Postal Department attempted a 2-color stamp, 32 years later, was the aforementioned 1901 Pan American Exposition, which was done in conjunction with the BEP, and once again produced 3 invert stamps. The Postal Department and BEP did not attempt another 2-color stamp until 1918, 17 years later, when the Postal Department issued the world's first airmail stamp, the 24-cent Carmen Rose and Blue Jenny Airpost stamp. Ironically, one sheet of 100 stamps with the Blue Jenny airplane flying upside down was not caught by quality control inspectors and was sold to the public. This was the BEP and Postal Department's most famous invert stamp. The most recent one of these 100 stamps, which was sold at auction in November 2023, fetched over $2 million for a single stamp. After this, quality control seemed to get it right, and other than a handful of color missing 2 or 3 color stamp issues, no inverts issues occurred until October 23rd, 1962, when a stamp honoring the late Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, was issued with 1 of 3 colors inverted. As soon as this discovery was made, the Postmaster General, J. Edward Day, ordered the BEP to print up 800,000 additional sheets, 40 million stamps of the invert stamp, and just in a deliberate effort to devalue the mistake, saying, quote, "The Post Office Department is not running a jackpot operation," end quote. On November 16th of that year, these stamps were put on sale to the public. There was a huge uproar over this obvious attempt to manipulate the stamp collecting market, but by then it was too late. The damage was done. As a result, today you can buy one of the invert stamps for 25 cents, the same price for the non-inverted regular issue. The only exception to this is if you have a stamp on cover, that means on an envelope, with a postmark between October 23rd and November 15th of 1962, and only if it has been authenticated by a recognized expertising committee, the value of that cover would be about $5,000. Now back to the commemorative story. I'll also make a quick note there. What made me interested in this, or why I put this in here, was the fact that the first 3 attempts that the Postal Service made of trying to put out bicolored stamps ended up with, inverted stamps and mistakes like that. So it was just interesting to see that. The next commemorative issue consisted of 5 stamps for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, also known as the St. Louis World's Fair, held in St. Louis, Missouri in 1904. These stamps ranged in values from 1 cent to 10 cents and were inscribed with the commemorative series 1904. They were issued in conjunction with the exposition's opening on April 30th of that year. Each stamp was a single color and no errors occurred. 3 of these stamps feature men who were intimately involved in Louisiana Purchase in 1803. U.S. Ambassador to France Robert Livingston on the 1 cent green, President Thomas Jefferson on the 2 cent carmine, and Secretary of State and future President James Monroe on the 3 cent violet. The 10 cent red-brown stamp shows a map of the Louisiana Purchase, the first map to appear on a U.S. stamp. The subject of the 5 cent dark blue depicts William McKinley, who had nothing to do with the Louisiana Purchase. He earned his place on the stamp because he was the president who signed the legislation giving federal sanction to the exposition. The stamp also became a memorial to McKinley, who 3 years earlier in 1901 had been assassinated while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. The Louisiana Purchase issue was followed in 1907 by an issue for the Jamestown Exposition held in Hampton Roads near Norfolk, Virginia. The 3 stamps bearing the inscription commemorative series of 1907 were issued in 1, 2, and 5 cent denominations and commemorated the 300th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown settlement. The settlement was the first permanent British colony in America following the 1587 failure of the Roanoke settlement in what is now North Carolina. The red 2 cent denomination depicts the landing of the English colonists in an illustration titled Founding of Jamestown 1607. 2 of the most recognized figures associated with the settlement are depicted on the other 2 stamps. Captain John Smith, who promoted the settlement and is credited with its success, is portrayed on the 1 cent green stamp. And Pocahontas, who purportedly intervened to save the life of Captain Smith, is portrayed on the blue 5 cent stamp. In 1909, the first non-exposition commemorative was issued, known as the Lincoln Centenary of Birth issue. It was issued not only to celebrate the anniversary of his birth, but to appease a disappointed public who complained that the 1908 definitive series issue had not included the likeness of Lincoln. Until then, Lincoln's likeness had been represented on all definitive series issues since 1866. The 2 cent Lincoln stamp of 1909 had the dimensions of a definitive stamp, but it was the first U.S. single stamp commemorative issue. It was also the first commemorative issue with and without perforations, referred to as imperforate. That same year, 2 more expositions stamps were issued. One for the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition held in Seattle, Washington, and the second for the Hudson Fulton celebration in New York and New Jersey. Each of these stamps were issued in 2 cent denominations and were also issued in 2 forms, both perforated and imperforate. The first stamp was to commemorate the development of the nation's Northwest Territory on the 10th anniversary of the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush and the 40th anniversary of the 1867 purchase of Alaska. A likeness of William Seward, the Secretary of State responsible for negotiating the purchase, was featured in the stamp design. The exposition was planned for 1907, but was delayed until 1909 so as not to compete with the Jamestown Exposition. The Hudson Fulton celebration, held in New York and New Jersey between September 25th and October 11th, 1909, though not a fair or exposition in the traditional sense, this massive celebration, which stretched the length of the Hudson River from Staten Island to Troy, a distance of over 150 miles, had all the flavor of a fair. It was a combined commemoration of the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson's discovery and exploration of the Hudson River and the centenary of Robert Fulton's steamship, the Claremont, which plied the waters of the Hudson, introducing steam navigation. Over 2 million people attended the celebration during the 2 weeks that it ran. 1,595 watercraft of all type were anchored in or moving along the Hudson River during the river, including 20 American battleships, a naval squadron from England, and other naval vessels from France, Germany, the Netherlands, Mexico, and Argentina. There were ferry boat tenders, yachts, and sailboats of all types and sizes, along with the luxury liner, the Lusitania. Replicas of both Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, and Fulton's steamboat, the Claremont, steamed up and down the river. And Wilbur Wright even flew his Wright Flyer up and down the river and around the Statue of Liberty. This was the first actual public showing of the airplane, even though you could see it flying if you went out to one of the airfields they were testing it at. This is the first time it was actually used as a public display. The issue for the first commemorative celebrating, this issue was the first commemorative celebrating more than one topic on a single stamp. Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, and Fulton's steamboat, the Claremont, or at least the reproductions of them built for the celebration, are anachronistically depicted side by side on the stamp. Like both the Lincoln and Alaska Yukon Pacific issues, the Hudson Fulton stamp was a single stamp commemorative issued in perforated and imperforate sheets. In 1915, the Panama Pacific Exposition issue commemorated the World's Fair held in San Francisco from February 20th to December 4th of that year. Planning for the event began in 1911, just 5 years after the great earthquake that destroyed the city. All 4 stamp designs of the issue were inscribed San Francisco 1915, but were released January 1st, 1913 to give advance notice of the event. They were reissued in December 1914 and sold throughout 1915 during the fair. Each stamp of the series commemorated an historical event. The 1-cent green stamp commemorated the 400th anniversary of Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa's discovery of the Pacific Ocean on September 1st, 1513. And the yellow-orange 10-cent stamp commemorated the discovery of San Francisco Bay in 1769 by Spanish explorer Gaspar de Portola. The blue 5-cent stamp illustrating the Golden Gate, the entrance to San Francisco Bay, and the red 2-cent Panama Canal stamp celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal completed the issue. The color of the 10-cent yellow-orange stamp in the first release was criticized because it showed so poorly, which you can kind of see here. It's not as easy to read. So a darker orange shade was issued in a reprint in August of 1913. The new color was also used in the 1914 reissue. The stamp sheets of the original release were also criticized for being too brittle, as they were originally perforated 12 gauge. When the stamps were reproduced in late 1914 and early 1915, the Postal Department switched to 10 gauge perforations, which were more popular with the public as it allowed for more easily handling the stamps. I don't know if you can see it well here, but the perforation holes are the same size, but in the upper ones, which are the 10 gauge, there's more space between the holes, and that made the stamps, hold together better. The 12 gauge had a tendency to, once it folded, they just started kind of tearing right down that fold very easily. While other commemorative stamps were issued during the intervening years, it wasn't until 1926 the next stamp for a World Exposition was issued. This was for the sesquicentennial exposition held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The exposition was open between June 1st and December 1st, 1926. This 2-cent Carmen Rose colored stamp featured the Liberty Bell and the inscription Sesquicentennial Exposition across the top and was issued in perforated sheets of 50 stamps on May 10th in advance of the fair's opening. For the second time, the Postal Department issued a pre-printed postal envelope for the event. It featured, as in the stamp, an image of the Liberty Bell and was labeled Sesquicentennial Exposition. It was printed in Carmen and had a 2-cent denomination. Then in 1933, the next stamps were issued for the Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. There were 2 stamps issued in the definitive series. In the definitive size rather than a commemorative size, in sheets of 100. And again, as with Alaska, Yukon, Pacific, and Hudson Fulton expositions, in 1909, they were in 2 types, perforated and imperforate, although on this occasion, the 2 imperforate stamps were released as 2 souvenir sheets of 25 stamps each without gum on the back. They were to mark and be distributed at the convention of the American Philatelic Society, also taking place in Chicago that year. These stamps were issued in 1-cent and 3-cent denominations. The 1-cent yellow-green stamp depicts the restoration of Fort Dearborn, a pioneer outpost on the site of Chicago's World's Fair and part of Chicago's early settlement history. The stamp bears the inscription Chicago Century of Progress across the top. The 3-cent purple stamp depicts the new Art Deco Federal Building, also on the fairgrounds, with 2 inscriptions at the top, Century of Progress on the left and Chicago 1883 to 1933 on the right. These 2 stamps and buildings were meant to provide a contrast by which to measure the city's progress. One of the most popular events during the course of the fair was the arrival of the German Graf Zeppelin on October 26, 1933. The Zeppelin circled over the fair for 2 hours and before taking a brief 25-minute landing, and then took off for Akron, Ohio. The Postal Service Department issued a stamp to commemorate the flight. It was issued in an airpost stamp of 50-cent denomination. 2 years later, in 1935, the next exposition commemorative stamp was issued, a single stamp celebrating California Pacific International Exposition held in San Diego, California. This exposition coincided with the 400th anniversary of the discovery of the Pacific Southwest by Spanish explorer Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. The design shows a view of the exposition grounds with Point Loma and San Diego Bay in the background. The stamp was issued in perforated sheets of 50 and a 3-cent denomination. In 1939, 2 stamps were issued for 2 separate fairs, one for the Golden Gate Exposition in San Francisco, California, and the second for the 1939 New York World's Fair in New York, New York. The design of the Golden Gate Exposition stamp shows the Tower of the Sun, one of the outstanding architectural features of the exposition, and held on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. The design of the New York World's Fair stamp features the image of the Trilon and Perisphere, outstanding architectural features and theme structures of that fair. Both stamps were issued in perforated sheets of 50 with a 3-cent denomination. In 1958, the Postal Service issued the only World Exposition commemorative stamp for a fair held outside the United States, when it issued a stamp for the Brussels Universal and International Exposition in Brussels, Belgium, also known as Expo 58 or the Brussels World's Fair. It was the first World's Fair held since World War II, which probably played a part in the Postal Department's decision to issue a stamp for this World's Fair. The stamp featured a bird's eye view of the United States Pavilion, and the stamp was issued in perforated sheets of 50 and a 3-cent denomination. The next stamp for a World's Fair was issued in 1962 for the Century 21 Exposition, or Seattle's World's Fair in Seattle, Washington. This World's Fair was the first one to be held in the United States since the 1939 New York World's Fair, and would precede the next New York World's Fair by 2 years. The stamp featured the theme structure of the fair, the Space Needle, with a monorail zipping by at its base. The stamp was issued in sheets of 50 in 2 colors and a 4-cent denomination. 2 years later, a single stamp was issued for the 1964-65 New York World's Fair, held in New York, New York. The stamp featured a view down the main concourse with the theme structure, the Unisphere, in the background, and a statue named the Rocket Thrower, a godlike man throwing a rocket into the air while reaching for a constellation of stars in the foreground. The stamp was a single color issued in sheets of 50 and 5-cent denomination. It might be noted that the rocket thrower actually faced the Unisphere, but was reversed for the stamp design for artistic consideration. Along with the commemorative stamp, the Postal Department also issued a stamped envelope featuring a very simple stylized representation of the Unisphere. It was printed in maroon or red, and in this image, you can see there's 2 other envelopes that were purchased by companies that overprinted their own designs on the left-hand side, and they were used for first day of issue cover, what are called cover sheets. And I've put in 2 because one shows both the envelope and the original stamp from the that was issued by itself. Starting in 1968, 7 stamps were issued over the next 16 years for expositions held, or World's Fairs held in the United States. The first was for Hemisphere 68, held in San Antonio, Texas. The theme of the fair was the confluence of civilizations in America, celebrating the many nations which settled the region. The fair was held to coincide with the 250th anniversary of the founding of San Antonio in 1718. The design of the stamp symbolized San Antonio at the center of the North and South American hemisphere. The stamp was issued in sheets of 50 in 2 colors and a 6-cent denomination. The next stamp was issued for Expo 74 in Spokane, Washington. The Expo 74 stamp design was created by legendary pop artist Peter Max. It features a cosmic jumper traveling the sun, sky, sea, and earth in Max's signature style and vibrant color palette. The design was intended to support the theme of the fair, preserve the environment. The stamp was issued in perforated sheets of 40 in multiple colors and a 10-cent denomination. In 1982, the Postal Service issued a block of 4 stamps for the Knoxville World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee. Artist Charles Harper of Cincinnati, Ohio, developed the energy-themed stamps by graphically depicting 4 energy sources. The designs emphasize the importance of solar energy, synthetic fuel energy, nuclear energy, and fossil fuel energy. They were issued in perforated sheets of 50 in multiple colors and a 20-cent denomination. Finally, the last stamp the Postal Service would issue to date for World Expositions was issued in 1984 for the Louisiana World Exposition in New Orleans, Louisiana. The freshwater theme of the exposition was featured on the stamp by depicting a southern bayou inhabited by a variety of birds, fish, and reptiles. The stamp was issued in perforated sheets of 40 in multiple colors and a 20-cent denomination. This did not, however, end the issuance of stamps from the Postal Service associated with World's Fairs. although the first of these stamps connected to a world exposition was actually released 1 year before the Knoxville World's Fair. In 1981, a block of 4 stamps commemorating American architecture included a stamp honoring Bernard Maybeck with the image of the Palace of Fine Arts, which he designed for the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. The stamp was issued in 2 colors and an 18-cent denomination. For reasons that may have had to do with the lettering layout and readability, the BEP titled the stamp Palace of Arts, not the Palace of Fine Arts. I decided to take a look and see what might have looked like if they had put in the full name. And in creating this stamp issue on the right, I had to reduce the lettering of the upper line by about 15% to fit all the letters in there. So I don't know why they couldn't have done that themselves, but they made a decision to mistitle it. In 1992, as part of Christopher Columbus's 500th anniversary of the discovery of the New World, the Postal Service reissued the 1893 World Columbian Exposition stamps on 6 mini souvenir sheets, 5 of which had 3 stamps each and 1 had a single stamp. The stamps were all issued with the same values of 1 cent to $5 as the original 1893 issues. These stamps were also released as a joint issue of the same stamp souvenir sheets by Italy, Spain, and Portugal. A side note here. In my own opinion, when you look at some of these reissued stamps, not in all cases, but in some of them, you'll see that their color seems a little more subdued in some of them. With the issue we're looking at here, the difference in the color between the 2 $4 stamps, the reddish one, that actually was a different color used in the reprint, where all the other stamps use the exact same color in their reprint. This sheet looks a little more like it should. But I think it has something to do with the engraving used for these stamps, which a lot of it was done by a computer. And also it has to do, I think, with the printing inks of today, which are, I think, a finer ink, but it tends to have while it shows more detail at times, it doesn't fill the stamp in. And so again, as you look at some of these, you'll see there are some differences in the value on those stamps. And I just found that it was interesting that they, even though you used the same color ink and the same plate designs, they just didn't come out in some cases quite as vibrant. Anyway, that's my opinion. So there's the final stamps you can see here in that stuff. Then, as mentioned earlier, in 1998, for the 100th anniversary of the original release, the Postal Service reissued the Trans-Mississippi Exposition stamps the way they had been designed and intended, as 2-color stamps. All 9 stamps appearing in 1 souvenir sheet, and the $1 stamp appearing 9 times on a second souvenir sheet. They bore the same values of the original issue, except for the 2-cent and $2 stamps. The reason for this, or should I say, when the images were, the images, as you can see, were switched. So you have the bridge now on a 2-cent stamp where it had been on a $2 stamp, and the farming in the West was on a 2-cent stamp, which is now on a $2 stamp in the reissue. This wasn't an error or an oversight. It was actually a return to the original design concept. Originally, the 2-cent stamp was intended to be the image of the bridge over the Mississippi River, the longest in the world at that time. And the $2 stamp was intended to feature farm workers in the field labeling "Harvesting the West." A last-minute decision was made to switch the 2 images, as it was decided to put the farming scene on the 2-cent stamp, a stamp that would be used more often than the $2 stamp and would be more representative of the work it took to tame the Midwest and West. They also changed the label to farming in the West because it was noted that the original photograph was workers plowing a field, not harvesting. They wanted to correct the mislabeling. So when the Postal Service decided to reissue the stamps, they returned to the original design positions with the bridge on the 2 cent and keeping the copper red color of the original 2 cent release for its surround. And the farm workers on the $2 stamp keeping the original orange brown color of the $2 release for its surround, including the original label on the stamp, Harvesting the West. The interesting thing is that in going back to this original label, they recreated a mistake that was corrected in the original issue. So kind of weird little twist of things that went on there. While these stamps did fulfill the original design concept, and what I've done here is I've shown the original design. I overlaid them on one of the sheets, and you can see the equivalent next to them. Again, the colors, and especially here, seem much more muted. And again, I think it's because of this ink. And although in this case, they actually did use the original plate etchings or not etchings, but blanking out on my word here. The original,
Engravings,
what's that?
engravings.
Yeah, engraving. That was the word I couldn't come up with in my head. Yeah, the original engraved plates were used for the reissue. And so, but again, I think it's the ink situation. You can see, other than maybe the Indian and the buffalo, which does seem more dramatic in the two-color stamp, and possibly the red surround on the cattle in the winter storm. They just are a little more muted. They also decided not to use the same color on this 50-cent stamp down here. It was actually a sage green in the original issue with green above, and they just used green for both of them on this reissue. I've got another one here that shows a little bit of the difference again with the $2 and 2 cent stamp changeover. The one thing I will say in defense of the newer inks and stuff, when it came to the black image, and I'm going to blow this up here a little bit so you can see it, like the detail in the bridge as you compare it to the image now on the right of the screen, you can see there's a lot more detail in the shadows. You can see more detail in this boat. You can see the actual windows. You can actually see that there are people on the dock down here walking up to the boat, which are just totally lost in the one down here. But in the frame, the thing that I notice is, and it doesn't show quite as clearly on this one, but in a lot of the new stamps, the space in between the line, the inked line, say in this area here, and this area here, is essentially the white of the paper. And in the original issue, there was a hint of the color. And I think this is some bleed over that occurs with the heavier inks and that sort of thing. So there's also a difference. You can't see it as dramatically here, but when I move this over, you can see how in all these stamps, this upper layer of grain versus the upper layer of grain here was lighter color. It gave more of a layering effect. And here they're all the same. You don't get that heavier, darker shadowed image as you did in here. So there's just some, and also maybe a little bit of this corn down here seems to read stronger and more detail of that shows, especially you can see it here where it's almost, didn't non-existence here. You can see the shuck around the corn has some stuff to it. So that's just a interesting point that I thought I'd bring up and that. Okay, and then now following back here to where I was. Oh, I have to do this. Okay. Following this, in 2001, the Postal Service issued a souvenir sheet commemorating the three 1901 Pan American Exposition inverts with their original values of 1 cent, 2 cents, and 4 cents, along with the four 80-cent stamps laid out in a diamond shape based on a souvenir Cinderella stamp available in 1901 at the Pan American Exposition. A Cinderella stamp is a label that resembles a postage stamp, but which is not issued by a postal department or government administration for postal purposes. So there is the original Cinderella stamp. This is the postage stamp, as you can see on the sheet here. The differences that between them is on the Cinderella stamp from 1901, the two ovals on either side of the image of the bison have just 1901 in them. And in the new version of it, one says USA, the one on the left, the one on the right says 80, and that made it an 80-cent stamp. Again, I'll just bring out that here shows the original stamps versus the new prints. While these came much closer to them, again, I think there's a stronger feel in the color of the original issues, especially in this brown 4-cent stamp, where you can really see the difference between getting some color in between versus the white of the background. Some of that, I have to admit, is part of the paper coloration, but it's also just reads as a much stronger stamp design. And then in 2022, the Postal Service once again honored the Palace of Fine Arts from San Francisco, Panama Pacific Exposition when its likeness again adorned a stamp. The Priority Mail Express stamp for 2022 in multiple colors with a value of $26.95. This time they used the correct name label for it. So as you can see, it is Palace of Fine Arts. So that was the last stamp issued there. Then a little bit of quick history here as we come to the end of this. In 1928, the Bureau International de Exposition, or BIE, was formed to sanction and regulate all international expos and world's fairs. The United States first joined the BIE in 1968, but following the New Orleans Fair, the United States membership in the BIE was revoked in 2001 due to non-allocation of funds by the U.S. Congress for 2 consecutive years, and there have been no further World's Fairs in the United States. However, in 2017, President Donald Trump signed the U.S. Wants to Compete for a World Expo Act into law, a bill reasserting America's interest in once again joining the BIE, with the hope that the United States would host a specialized expo in 2023 in Minnesota. Though that fair did not happen, the United States did rejoin the BIE on May 26, 2017, and is still an active member. So there still may be future fairs and additional stamps for them in the United States' future. And with that, there's the end of my presentation.
Well done, Brock. As long as you still have the slides up, there were two elements that when we discussed this earlier, you missed going through today. One was the Wright brothers with the canoe, and the other was the Zeppelin with the hangar. I thought you might want to just go back
yeah.
and
Well, yeah, I'll go back quickly through these to get to those stamps here. Yeah, I forgot to mention that, although it might have come up in discussions there. Okay, we'll do this one first. There's a Zeppelin. The design of the stamp, this is obviously the federal building at Century 21. And then there's this building here, which is actually a hangar for the blimp. And that's the hangar that was, I have a photograph, I don't have it available right now, that shows a picture of the Graf Zeppelin flying over Germany, over its base where it stays, and that's what this building is over here. It is the actual building they would keep it in when it wasn't flying. So that was the connection. This is over in Germany. This is over the United States. This stamp also was commemorating the fact that the flight, the Zeppelin was going into several cities in the United States and then would fly back to Germany. It had originated in Germany, so it was kind of a round trip flight to show off the ship and that sort of thing. And then the other one that he mentioned was back at the Hudson Fulton. There we go. Yeah, in this picture, you can see it that Wilbur Wright actually went out and bought a canoe in New York and attached it to his airplane because he knew he was going to be flying over the water quite a bit of the time. And so he imagined that it would help the plane stay a little bit afloat and give him a way of escaping if he had to make a water landing, which he never had to do. Interestingly, he didn't use it the whole time because in the next picture where he's flying over the statue, around the Statue of Liberty, the boat is not there. So, but that's
Cool.
that sort of thing. Yep.
Great.
We
Well, I
can-
tell you, as a collector of stamps, I enjoyed it. I did have one thought, was that they could have balanced the World's Fair budget if they had made Belgian waffle flavored stamps.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the thing I talked about in the very beginning, how the new stamp size was not popular with some people, it prompted some news articles that came out about it, complaining, and then some that made fun of the whole thing. Like, a news article saying, yeah, my boss hates him because now he has to hire 2 people to lick all the stamps to put on the envelopes because they run out of saliva too fast. And there was a few other parodies they did on that. So it was kind of a fun and interesting thing.
Did they ever do a stamp with a flavor to it?
I don't recall. It seems to me there was something that was done. I think recently there was some stamps that came out with popsicles on them. This was about in the last 5 or 6 years. And I think those had kind of a scratch and sniff capability. I don't think they had flavor to them.
Oh, okay.
Because those stamps now, those are all the serpentine die cut, and they're you just peel and stick, so you
Right.
don't lick a stamp anymore. But I
Happy
don't.
birthday, Papa.
It's raining too.
What's that? Oh, somebody's talking to
Sorry.
somebody else. That's okay.
Ray, you
raining
had
where
some
you are?
comments or questions in the chat.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
also,
let me-
Byron has his hand up.
Yeah, let me go pull. I have to expand my window here so I can. Come on, where's the expansion for it? It went down to.
Yeah, I can read it for you. A few people had to drop out and said thanks, they were enjoying
Okay.
it, and they'll catch up on the video. But then Debbie asked Brock, what did people do before stamps? Did they pay the postmaster and he did some sort of stamp? So every letter had to be taken to the postmaster. Also, they should have gotten you to lay at the Palace of Fine Arts.
Well, actually, that is a good question. There are stamps that were issued locally. They weren't part of the postal department, but local states issued some stamps. You can collect some of these that would be used, and the post office would. I guess they worked in conjunction with the post office, coordinating the amounts and stuff like that to go with whatever the price of the stamp should be at that time. And then I think the postal department decided that, it'd be easier if we just issued the stamps and everybody uses the same stamp. And we don't have all these competing different stamps put out by, people or little postal agencies within a state or something that, the next state has to look at and say, well, is that the right amount or, whatever. So, but that's essentially was it. You would pay, or I think in the very early going, before there was even a postal department, you would pay the post writer. He would come around and you would give him a letter and he'd say, okay, that's 3 cents or whatever it was. And you'd give him the 3 cents. So
How did the Pony Express fit into this? Was it federal or was that private?
no, that was a federal thing. They used private contractors that they hired to do that. And they've commemorated the Pony Express. It only lasted for what, 1.5 years, 2 years, I think. And then they, came up with the overland, stagecoach and mail that way.
Oh, and Telegraph, yeah.
And Telegraph, of course, came out, and so if you really needed to get something there quickly, you could do it by Telegraph, and if it wasn't that important, then you just send it by regular post, and it got there when it got there.
All right, Brock had it. Baron had his hand up, and then Wayne after that. So Baron.
Okay.
Yes, nice, Brock. Forgive me, I came in late at the point that you were talking about the invert stamps, and
Okay.
I have 2 questions on 2 different subjects. The first one with regard to the inverts. Had you mentioned prior to me coming in about the fact that the invert stamps could have been nefarious with regard to printing that they were done that way, or was it just complete happenstance that that error was made numerously on these stamps? Because it seems to me, you know, as skilled as it was and as detailed as it was at that time, you know, how would they do? How would they have somebody? You know, how would they end up getting them upside down like that? Do you
Well,
have a comment on that?
yeah, you have, when you print a stamp like that at that time, nowadays things are done a little differently. But at that time, it would take 2 runs through the press. And if for some reason, you know, as these were going through the press, sometimes the pressman or his foreman or somebody would pull a sheet off and take a look at it, make sure the quality was still running good. Because sometimes, you know, in printing these, they'd get over inked, and so the ink was just horrible, or they were running out of ink. Different things would come up, but they would just pull them out to check them for quality control, and then you know, as these presses were running and dumping a new sheet on, they would put it back in. Well, sometimes they just didn't watch carefully what they were doing, and they got put in, and they might have taken 2 or 3 out at a time, and one of them got turned around and so set back in to the pile for the second run of stamps. The reality is, what's interesting, everybody, and I used it here because it was, you know, simpler to explain it, but especially on the first of the inverts with the Pan American Exposition, technically the inversion is actually the outer frame of the stamp, not the inner picture, because the inner picture was printed first, and then when they put them in for the second run of color, they were upside down relative to where, you know, they were supposed to, their position was supposed to be in the press. So what got printed upside down was the surround. But when you look at a stamp and you read a stamp, you know, all the writing is there. That's the part you put right side up and look at. So that's and I'll go ahead.
No, I was going to say that makes a little more sense and a little clearer to me. I was originally thinking that they were putting the plates in upside down and then running them, and this is nobody was checking them, and this is how they turned out. You're saying that it wasn't the plates that were inserted upside down; it was the sheets after being checked or something, that a whole stack of them just somehow got turned around, and then the whole stack of sheets went in and were run backwards.
Yeah, and it didn't happen that much. As you saw, these were, the Pan Americans were run on plates that had 4 sheets on each plate of 100 stamps each. So 400 stamps. And so there were 700 that got released in the 1 cent stamps that got released. So that means only 2 sheets went through, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't talk about it a lot, but I've heard that, yeah, once it was discovered, one of the postmasters was, you know, handing out a sheet of stamps to a person, and realized, hey, that one's upside down, and pulled it back. So that's why 700, not 800. And the other ones were 200. And again, some were caught on that. And then you had the 4 sheets that were released also of the 4 cents. So they used 1 plate and ran it through on purpose in that particular case, because they thought that the assistant postmaster was saying, hey, I want an invert sheets sent to me. And so that's what they interpreted. I brought up this image here. You can see in the Dag Hammarskjöld stamp, because on the other stamps, the inverts ended up being pretty well centered within the ovals that they were supposed to be, because the sheets were usually about the same size all the way around. They didn't have wide borders. You can see on the right-hand Dag Hammarskjöld stamp here that there's more paper there, and on the left side of the sheet there would have been less paper. So when this got reversed, it not only put it upside down, but it shifted the color to one side. So you notice here in the original stamp, the 4 cents down over here on the left is a white background. Here it's got a yellow background.
Right.
Up here you can see the white background that was supposed to be there. If you reverse that, and the whole shift. The same thing top and bottom. The top and bottom aren't always the same spacing on the more modern sheets, and so that caused both a shift to the right and a shift slightly upward of that miscolored situation.
Okay, second question has to refer to the reissues, specifically like the Columbus reissue and the latter ones that you were speaking about with the bridge and the farming or harvesting of the land stamps. And you were speaking more specifically about the lack of color in the reissues. One of the things I was looking at is are the stamps that you're presenting, are these in your collection, or are these photographs that you have acquired elsewhere that you've used for your presentation? And that would lead me to how I want to ask the second part of this question.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with this. Now, I'll be honest with you. These stamps in this particular case are not photos or scans from my collection. When I scanned it, my scanner was almost too perfect, and it made them look even. These that I have here, if you were looking at this and you had one of my sheets and looked at it, you would see the exact same color and color saturation in them. So this is the way they should look. When I did mine, I originally had them in here. The color was way down because it was almost too detailed. Something about scanning it that just didn't bring the color out. So I spent quite a bit of time going through the internet, finding images of these stamps until I could find ones to say, okay, that's on screen. That looks exactly like what you'd have in your hand. So as we go to this set of sheets here, the coloration variation you see is because of what I was pointing out before, as far as the way the ink flowed within those stamp dyes and things. It just doesn't come off quite as strong. There's more of an artist kind of quality, I think, to the original issues, and more of a technician's quality to the other ones. Not that they don't look pretty, but you know.
Yeah. Well, when you had zoomed in on, I think that just last frame that you had there before this one, or zoom in of the stamps. Yeah, I mean, here, what I was noticing is that maybe in the background of the original stamps, where it's supposedly a white background, it is a color of the print or of the ink itself as compared to the reprints. And the second part of the question was, well, okay, are those two original stamps, the photographs of those two original stamps, was the white balance set correctly to where the stamps itself have a cast of the red color that really shouldn't be there, or was it indeed that was the color of the paper at the time that the stamp was printed on, compared to almost pure white paper that the reprints were printed on?
Well, that's a good point, and I think it's a combination of those things. It wasn't so much these stamps over time do age, especially with the older papers that were used back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So there's a certain amount of aging that occurs there. Although I've seen evidence on some of the stamps. Let me go. This one, no, I want to go the other way. This green one here, you'll find some of them that there's kind of a green cast in the surround. I don't know if we can zoom in too much on this one, because yeah, there you go. There's sometimes a little bit of a green cast, but even with that, I can't show them both at the same time. You can see though that there was just a richer, heavier color done with the surround. And in this case, these stamps, they actually use the original engraving for them. And it just didn't come out as strong in the color. And like I say, it's kind of disappointing that they decided to just use the same green here and here, where here you can see the difference between the two greens.
Did the paper have something to do with it too at the time?
Well, I think it's more maybe an issue of the ink, and I want to look into this further and see what I can find out. Because I know they, for the type of printing they do nowadays and stamps, when especially if we go, let's go ahead to like this one here. The fineness that the ink has to be in order to, because these are layers of color over
Right.
one another, as they pass through. If you had too thick of an ink, you couldn't do that with the thicker inks that they used to use. And so in using that, I think it keeps the finer detail. And in the case of the black and white insert, as I said, when you looked at like this one here, you can see how much more detail is in there. Even the city in the background, see back here, it's kind of lost to I mean, it's a city, but you can't see much here. It's, oh yeah, there's buildings and windows and doors,
Mhm.
so
You can tell
if,
that's not the same bus that drove off into the river a few years back.
Okay. Thank you, Brock.
yeah, sure.
Great, Wayne's had his hand up.
Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering if any foreign countries issued stamps related to US fairs. If
I'm
they
not sure. I'm not a world stamp collector, and that would be interesting to look at that because there are a lot of stamp departments in other countries that issue stamp, like Disney stamps. You get those all over the place. I mean, all these different countries put them out because Disney's a popular thing, and they're doing it, a lot of that, for collectors. They're trying to say, oh, here's a guy that specializes in Disney or space travel or any of this sort of stuff. You see some of the other stamps out there that are put out by other stamp agencies, and there's a huge amount of them. And so it's very possible that there were some expositions that were also touted by other postal departments.
Yeah,
I'm
for
just not aware of
example,
it because I,
yeah, the 1964 World's Fair, for example, had quite a few stamps that were put out by other countries. And again, they use the Unisphere, that sort of thing. So, then for others that are, I mean, that was the one with the U.S. connection. There's others, like for example, Okinawa. They put out tons of stamps for different countries who were there at Okinawa, again to raise money. But there have been a number of them, but most of the foreign ones I know of in the United States were about the 64 fair.
yeah, and there may have been some other ones also, but yeah, there's every time, and it also can be how the fair organizers work with other countries and say, hey, do you want to do this? Where our postal department has very explicit rules as to what they will allow and not allow postage stamps to be. And of course, their rule about living persons on it a few years ago was very blatantly overlooked, and I've never reached out to find out why they suddenly allowed it, or maybe they've changed their rules or relaxed them. But they put out a Harry Potter series that came in a little booklet form, and it had actual pictures of the stars from that movie, which you'd almost have to have if that's what you're trying to advertise. We're trying to reach out to younger people, get them into collecting stuff like that, and that was a good thing. But the whole concept is, we don't want to say we had this person on a stamp because they were a great baseball player or whatever else while they were playing baseball, and then of course, it's just been reversed in the news recently, but like a Pete Rose situation comes along and they're suddenly shunned, and now that taints the the stamp, and the fact that they put it out for a person that it turns out that guy was a serial killer. We never knew it,
I
so they.
think the law was that you had to be dead for 10 years, and then they relaxed that for the first time for Walt Disney.
Yeah, and it's been since then. I think it's 5 years normal, except if you were a president.
Right.
And regardless of, even, with Nixon, when he died, within the year, a stamp came out. It had nothing to do with the fact that he was forced to resign. He had been president of the United States, and that was to honor one of our presidents who passed. You know, you can expect it sometime this year. There'll be a stamp for Jimmy Carter.
And I think with the Harry Potter thing, the thing I read was that they said, oh, this is not a picture of Daniel Radcliffe on a stamp, a real person. This is a picture of Harry Potter on a stamp, a fictitious person. And they really fudged the rules to make that one work.
Well, yeah, and I think that was with the case. I seem to recall having heard that too, because when I first saw it, it was like, that's interesting. How are they doing that? But you know, the fact is, it is Daniel Radcliffe playing that part. So it's no different than those guys plowing the field. They were a living person,
Right.
but they, you know, you wouldn't know it by the stamp because you couldn't identify their faces, but because it was from a photograph, it had been from a painting, that's a whole different thing, because then it's a likeness created by somebody else. Of usually in a painting, they're fictitious people, unless you've got, you know, a king of France, or, you know, lady so and so from wherever, you know, the old paintings and stuff like that. But yeah, it is interesting that there's this sort of stuff. Looks like Scott has a question.
Yes, Scott.
Hello, Brock. First off, my wife enjoyed your presentation. She's sorry she had to leave early. She noted that she has about a dozen of the stamps that you showed today in her books.
Mhm.
I think Bill may know. Wasn't there some action with regards to Robert Moses with the 64, with the international organization, the oversight?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a huge thing where he wanted to do a 2-year World's Fair. They only wanted to do 1-year World's Fairs. He wanted to charge admission to the international exhibitors. That's against the rule. Basically, he took every rule they had and decided to go against it. And that's why the 64 fair is not a sanctioned World's Fair.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Thank
you don't have to be a member of the BIE to be sanctioned, because, you know, we weren't a member of the BIE when Seattle happened, and Seattle was a sanctioned fair. One of the things I did do, anticipating there might be some questions of how many of these fairs were actually sanctioned by the BIE. Of course, the early ones, it's interesting. You go in retrospect, the BIE takes credit now for, like, the World Columbian Exposition. And there was a Centennial Exposition in 1876. They didn't put out any stamps for it. That was in Philadelphia for the 100th anniversary of the United States. And those are listed as sanctioned things, but they weren't. But you know, so the point is that they say, if you follow our rules, you don't have to be a member, but you got to follow our rules if you want a sanctioned thing. Is that correct, Bill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
you,
So
Brock.
yeah,
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, I was just did a talk on Tuesday about the 39 World's Fair and mentioned how they first announced it was the 1939-1940 World's Fair. Then they got to the BIE, and the BIE said you can only go for 6 months. So they amazingly changed it to the 1939 World's Fair. That's why all the merchandise says.
I haven't had a chance to look and see if they have any powered. Corded.
Hey, Ken, you have something?
Sorry, talking to my son.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, the whole thing with sanctioning is like with the 39-40 New York World's Fair, it was again a nudge, wink, wink thing. Grover Whalen went over to Paris a number of times, and all of a sudden his 2-year fair became a 1-year fair. But all the contracts said basically we expect to be here for 2 years. And then Tom has a question for you, Brock. What year and stamp was the first full color stamp? What was the first Disney stamp? Can't we design and print our own custom stamps now? And I have no idea what this one is. Do you know the song "Have Some Madeira, My Dear"?
I do know that song. It's one of my wife's and my favorite. That's from the I think that was that the Limelighters that
Yeah.
sang that one? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And yeah, it's a have some Madeira, my dear. Yes.
And he invites the girl to his apartment to show
Yes. Oh yeah.
her his
I know the
stamp
connection.
collection.
Oh, a stamp collection. Okay.
Well,
Which
sorry,
is,
you're at the tie-in.
and they made it, yeah, they made it even more racy by saying to view his collection of stamps,
Which are
all
all
unperforated.
unperforated.
Yeah, so it's like, oh, that makes it even more risque,
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, and what were the other two? Oh, the first
Three.
the first Disney stamp put out by the United States, and this is what I'm focusing on is United States because that's my collection, was the one for Walt Disney when he passed away, the one with all the characters.
I was afraid
around.
of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then and since then they've done a lot more of Disney art and stuff like that with quite a few issues. As far as the first full color stamp, I'd have to go back to my collection and look. It would be, I believe, somewhere in the 60s or 70s, actually maybe not even the 60s, because even then it was two color. They weren't put together in a way that was like a photograph. Nowadays it's a lot more, multicolor. You're looking at, even though they might be a painting, it's a reproduction of that painting. And in some cases they're done for the stamp, or they're recreated from something else. They just came out with an issue of stamps for our upcoming 250th anniversary of the nation. They've been releasing a couple of things, and one is it's called Battlefields of the American Revolution, and it's actually I think it's 16 stamps. No, 15 stamps. And an artist did all these paintings based on battles from the famous battlefields from the war and the important battles that made the difference. And a couple of them, they're like
Civil War?
No, this is the Revolutionary War.
Revolutionary War. Okay.
Yeah, because next year is the 250th anniversary of the country. And so they started last year with issue of a stamp for the First Continental Congress. And now they're doing some battlefields. They've just come out yesterday with the 250th anniversary of the Army, Navy, and Marines, which were created by the Continental Congress in 1775. And that's considered to be part of it. But the battlefield ones he did paintings for these stamps. There's 5 lines of stamps, and there'll be a wide, what looks like at first when you look at like that's a really long, wide stamp, this twice the size of a normal commemorative stamp, and then the one next to it is the normal size. But the wide one is actually 2 stamps. It breaks in the middle, and you've got, he designed it in a way to where you could have an image and see the stamp. But that's all done, from his paintings. They then created what they needed to print and reproduce those paintings in multiple colors, so it looks just like the paintings he did.
And what's the term, Brock, for a stamp that goes from one image to the next stamp?
One image. Oh, you mean it's there's a
Continuation.
Well, trying to think. There's a term, and I'm just blanking out on the very first. They call it a C tenet sometimes.
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, the C tenet, where you have more than one image. That for the 200th, for the bicentennial, they came out with 5 sheets of famous paintings that had been done about the American Revolution. Most of them have George Washington in them, but there's one of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and within that, they created 5 stamps by just locating a certain part of that painting and saying, we'll put perforations around that particular part of the image, then it'd be overprinted with a value of the stamp and the US postage and all that sort of stuff. So that it was very interesting because the stamp alone stood as a neat little stamp, a design and painting, and yet it was part of a bigger painting.
Yeah, I think the first one the U.S. that did might have been Project Gemini spacewalk, where the astronaut was on one stamp and a capsule was on the next one.
Yeah, that was the most famous original of those stamps, of the space race stamps that they came out with. They called that the twins.
Yeah.
Yes, and for a while that was a very expensive stamp, but there was a lot of people who speculated in it. That's part of why it's interesting. I did some research and found some information about the stamps that came out for the Columbian Exposition. And they actually have for three of the five stamps that were the dollar value stamps, they actually have numbers for how many sold, either by keeping that number or how many they destroyed at the end, what was left. And surprisingly, they were, because these were things that most people couldn't afford, and they didn't tie into, they talked about like the $5 stamp could only be used if you sent 60 pounds or 600 pounds or something of books at the book rate. That's where that stamp could be used. But a lot of collectors, a lot of stamp dealers speculated that these stamps were going to be very popular, which they were, and bought a bunch of them up. So that the $5 stamp, they only printed 27,350 of those stamps, but they sold 21,000 of them. So $136,000 in face value. They got 109,000 for them. But that was 80%, 87% for the $4 stamp, 89% for the 3. And then there was a number up above for the 6-cent stamp that had actual numbers for it. And it sold 99% of its stamps. And what's interesting is the 6-cent stamp didn't connect to any particular postal rate. And so, it wasn't like, okay, a first class letter, I need the 2-cent stamp. You just slap it on there. The 6-cent was usually used in conjunction with other stamps to make a higher rate that you needed to do for something you were, if you'd put 2 cents on it and they said, well, you want to send this registered, we'll add the 6 cents to it, and there's the 8 cents. But they sold 99% of the 6-cent stamps because a lot of people speculated in these stamps that they were going to be popular and sell. And so for years, their value didn't go up. Now the value has gone up, and they're expensive stamps. But for years they didn't, because there was a glut in the market.
Well, I tell you, I got a kick out of watching the prices on the stamps, with the 1-cent stamp, the 2-cent, the 3-cent stamps, and then 4 cents. And it seemed after they got past 4 cents, it went to 10 cents, 20 cents, 80. I mean, right
Yeah,
up.
I know. They really have jumped. And of course, now, I mean, now twice a year the rate goes up on the darn stamps. And of course, they've solved an issue there with printing too many stamps of, the forever stamps. So you can be ahead of the game by buying them. If you bought a bunch of forever stamps 10 years ago when they first came out and had used them today for postage, you'd be saving yourself a lot of money. But it just saves them having to, because they used to do weird things like, okay, we know the rate's going to go up. We're asking Congress for a rate hike. They're going to pass it, but because they haven't yet, we have to come out with a new stamp for this particular thing. It's usually the flag stamp, as they call it, for the normal postage. So we're going to issue it with no value on it. It'll just have a letter or something else that says that stamp at that time is worth this much money. And then as soon as Congress said, okay, then they would do another run of the stamp with the 10 cents or 15 cents or whatever it was. And so, you have all these weird stamps that were only used for a short period of time. And, but that's the way they had to do it, because they couldn't wait to issue them. They had to get them out because they were running out of the stamps they had printed prior to that. And they didn't want to use them because their value, and sometimes it was they knew that when the stamp first came out, Congress was going to pass it like a week before. That's too soon to put the actual amount on the stamp. So we got to get them out there because we're running out of these other stamps. And then once we have that number, then we'll put it on the next run of stamps. They would just do a partial run of them.
Yeah, about 5 years ago, I went to mail a letter and I found I had a bunch of e-stamps. So I used some e-stamps on it, took it to the post office, and the clerk, I thought, was going to go into a meltdown trying to figure out what an e-stamp was for.
Yeah. Well, I've used those a couple of times, and when I do, I go in and say, okay, this represented this amount. So
Yeah.
that's what that is. And, and usually when those came out, the differences in stamps were maybe it went up 1 cent. So if worst case scenario, you lied about it, well, okay, they're only out by 1 cent.
Yeah, I'm saying I went in 20 years later and used an
Yeah.
I think the woman hadn't even been born when it came out.
Yeah, probably. You're right.
The other question I had on there was about customizing your own stamps.
There's a little bit of customization you can do, but I don't know, there's rules on that because again, the postal department doesn't want you putting out pornographic issues, anything like that or other things.
Sure.
They do have a lot that you can, that they set up, they design and they set, into a program that you can go in and say, oh, I like that design. I'm going to print my own stamps. Or it's not really a stamp in the true sense of the word, but it's a label that goes on the envelope. And there are some people who have attempted to collect those, but it's next to impossible to do because people, who knows what they're going to put out there
Yeah, they got
and how
into
they're going
trouble
to.
with that program when they first started it because one of the very first stamps somebody put out was David Duke, the white supremacist, and the guy printed up a bunch of them. And that's where they had to start changing their whole validation of what they'll allow to go on.
Okay.
Yeah, so usually it's a predetermined-ish picture that you can print up. Say you want to do it for your Christmas cards, they'll have a Christmas one that has something on it, and you just put and you can make whatever value you want it to be. Meaning, if you in your Christmas letters you were sending something to everybody that made it a 2-ounce package, well, you could do it as a 2-ounce stamp, and it covers the rate, and you have your own customized, semi-customized stamp, a quote unquote. But I've always found that because for years they were talking about when stamps went off sale, then they get destroyed. They call back from the local post offices to Washington, and then they're destroyed, either incinerated or, nowadays they probably just, cut them up. And, so there was a lot of, they were keeping numbers for a while, and I think they stopped doing it because people were starting to realize, you printed 400 million of that stamp and you destroyed 200 million of them because that's all that it sold, was only half of them. So isn't that a waste of money? And so they don't want people to know how much they're printing. But of course, with the forever stamp, they can keep them out there longer because they're still valid postage for first class. And because even that's the other thing about it. Say you bought a stamp 5 years ago, if it was still at the post office today, that same forever stamp that maybe at that time cost 25 cents, we'll say, and today postage might be 50 cents, you'll pay 50 cents for that forever stamp.
Right.
And that's also done something to the valuation of stamps for collecting that make it kind of interesting to me. And that is that because every year, you buy a stamp, every year the value of that stamp goes up because of, if you just wanted to use it for postage, instead of 25 cents, it's now worth 50 cents. Where, originally stamps went up by whatever their value was. So you're getting, there was a market markup that would be there. They would put in there saying, well, yeah, you can't buy it at the post office anymore. So now that puts an extra value on it, but it was only a little bit, a percentage up for what it was. And now that just keeps changing, not because it's a more collectible stamp, just because it's actually worth this much money.
Great. Well, I know you put a lot of effort into this, Brock, but I don't think people realize just two particular points that you really worked very hard on. Because we did several practice sessions. One was the getting sesquicentennial right.
Yeah, I know it's like the new one. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, the 250th one is going to be a tough one. The other one is I was really impressed how well your scan of your own personal Jenny came out.
Yes.
You can only
that's
about having some stamps, right?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. Not at 2 million. Well, you can buy them for less than 2 million. That happened to be the one stamp of the 100 that was the most perfect, meaning the perforations were lined up properly and it was very even. It isn't 100% perfect, but it's the most perfect. So that one went at a very high rate, but it's still going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I think now they're expecting that they're going to be over $1 million each.
Wow.
And if I'd had the money back when, 40 years ago, I could have bought one for $50,000. That'd be worth hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million today. But, I didn't have that much money then either. So,
Yeah.
So
No,
what
I've
is
got-
your most valuable stamp?
That's a good question. I don't know. I do have a stamp that I got. It came with a group of stamps. And when I first got it, I just assumed, I looked at it and said, okay, what is this stamp here? It was a what they call a coil stamp that comes on a coil of stamps. So two
Sure.
edges of it are straight and then there's perforations. And when I found it, I was saying, okay, this is fairly early on. I looked at it, studied it, finally figured out, okay, this is this stamp. Okay, that's what that one is. All right. Well, how much is that worth? And then I looked at it and it was like at that time, now it's worth about $3,000 today. At that time, it was worth about $800. Yeah, $800. And I
What's
had
the
just
image?
got it for penny. It's just a I can't even remember whose face is on it right off the top. Probably Benjamin Franklin's face, but it might be another old
Jefferson?
dead person.
Yeah.
Yeah, somebody like that. But when I first got it, it was like, this can't be right because I just paid, a few dollars for this group of stamps. It was just part of a package thing because it was like, is this? And I thought, well, maybe there's another one like it that's of less value, and that's what this one was. Well, I went through the whole listing of stamps. It's like, no, there's only two of this stamp. One is perforated all the way around, and one isn't at all, or one only has the two straight
Yeah.
edges.
Top and bottom.
And that's the one I somehow got. I want to look into it again now because I've learned a lot more about forgery stamps that are actually made from real postage stamps, but there's some out there that have a certain value that's very, very high, at least hundreds of dollars versus, a few dollars. And they made it both in perforated and imperforate. And so if the perforated one is the more expensive one, there are people that will try to perforate their own stamps. And I actually got one. I was buying a stamp that I was trying to fill in one of the higher values in my collection because I had some extra money. And when I got it, I scanned it and started looking at it, went, there's something wonky about this stamp. There's the perforations usually at least are half a hole, sometimes a little less, but they're perfectly aligned up and down or sideways. They don't wander around on the page, shall we say.
Right.
They also don't get wider as they keep getting wider, like like a parabolic kind of picture. And this had a lot of this in it. And I was able to determine, no, somebody has taken this from an imperforate sheet because and they also, their spacing is usually pretty close. I mean, because it's a machine, because it's paper, there can be some minute variation. But, I actually had a picture I was able to take off the internet of the same stamp that was a certified, it's been certified. This is that stamp, by a committee that does that sort of stuff, and compare the two. And it was like, yeah, this one's a fake. And so I contacted the seller and said, this isn't the stamp it's purported to be. And he said, well, just send it back to me. I'll give you your money back. And it's just like, yeah, and you're going to turn around and sell this to some other sucker that doesn't take the time to either accept it or not. But,
Okay.
there's a lot. So I want to look at that one I have and say, is it possible that is not because it's possible to make that stamp if you had a perforated stamp all the way around, that because the perforations can vary in the way that you'll have wider or taller stamps and narrower stamps because of the perforating machines that they used at the time, that if you had one far enough apart, you could slice off the perforations and it would look like it's the right stamp. So I've got to do some research into that one. Maybe it'll be disappointing.
Yeah, I
So
have.
you're saying, I'm sorry, Bill, I was going to say, you're saying, Brock, that neither you or yourself, Bill, have any stamps in your collection that are worth, a new home or quadruple bypass heart surgery or enough to
Well-
send us all to New York to visit the fair?
Well, I have several of them, but I'm not going to tell you where I keep them.
Okay.
That's what I was going to ask you, Brock. Where do you keep your most expensive stamp, and when are you on vacation?
Well, actually, they're just in my books behind me, and I keep thinking, I probably should invest in a safe to put these in. If for nothing else, if the house were to ever catch fire, while no individual stamp is that expensive, I've got some in the hundreds. I've got all the Colombian issues, although two of the dollar value ones are, or three of them are used stamps, but even those are expensive. But there's the collection itself is worth, tens of thousands of dollars. And I don't want to have that thrown away, not to mention just all the effort and I put into the collection, because I've gone back in recent years and reprinted a lot of my own pages, because I didn't like the way the company that was doing it was laying them out, and I wanted to feature certain things certain ways. And so I there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in that collection. And so I'm going like, yeah, I need to look into a safe here to, if nothing else, protect it from a fire.
Yeah, make sure you got a good fire rated one. Otherwise, you'll have a nicely protected pile of ashes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, Wayne made a comment in the chat that I think a lot of people could relate to. This has been really interesting, but it makes me glad I never started down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, it can be, and that's just about one. And none of these are particularly, other than the Colombian issues, some of the other issues, yes, are worth some money there. But for the most part, there it's just about the stamps that were for the Colombian. The whole U.S. stamp thing, the early stamps and most of the ones that are in the very expensive issue are, very similar stamps in their look. There's just little variations that occurred in them. And it's because they were printed by outside companies that, didn't, and the technology of the day, you can have 6 of the same stamp that looks essentially the same, but on the scrolling on the border, there are some stuff that's missing because the plate that it was made from didn't include those.
The
But
detail. Yeah.
and yeah, that detail was shaved off the plate. It's really weird. In the beginning, they really tried to shove these stamps as close together as they could to get as many on a sheet, and yet most of them, those didn't have perforations, so you had to cut them. So getting one that's not cut along one edge or something, that's not there. But that's different than these where it actually wasn't on the print. There was multiples of them made. And maybe only that plate was only used for a few hundred stamps, and you've got thousands of people around the world collecting stamps, so the value of those goes way up. And it's only some minor little thing that if you don't know it, you wouldn't know the difference. You could.
Yeah, it made me stop and think. I know I have at least a couple stamps where the perforations go right into the image area, and again, whether things were shifted over as they did it.
Yeah, well, oh yeah, they have some, there are errors that occur all the time in the printing process that don't get caught where, there's a shift in the perforations or the perforations got left out. I just got one from last year or 2024 or 2023. There was a coil stamp that ended up getting sold without perforations, and a guy had got some of them and he bought one of the coils and he was offering them online for a fairly reasonable price. So I picked one up, just, okay, this happens all the time, but I've got one now that I can put in the collection next to the regular one. And, maybe down the road, it'll be worth more for somebody, not when I'm alive, but
Yeah, Darren had a question for you. Did you lick early stamps or did you use a glue?
the earliest stamps actually still had gum on them. I think even the first ones did. It was a different kind of gum than today. There were some that came out, as I mentioned, imperfect. Most of those were done as souvenir type stamp. They were a real postage stamp, and you could use them like the Century of Progress stamps. Those 2 souvenir sheets that came out did not have gum on the back. They were intended to be for collectors to keep and collect, but you could use them for postage because they were legal postage, but you would have had to put your own glue on the back and stick them down. So most
So
stamps
both.
come out. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember what was the first one that they've done, with their the ones we have today, where you peel and stick. But I remember the first one they did, the glue that they put on it really was very acidic and is totally, all those stamps look like crap now because
Yes,
of the glue they used.
that was a Christmas issue. And that was, oh yeah, when was that? It was before they developed the glues that they have today, where and you're right, it was a white background stamp, and now if you get it, it's kind of a brownish background, and can be speckled even, depending on how the glue went through it.
Yeah, mine looks like it's a Palomino pony.
Yeah,
Well, I tell you, I
it's
really
almost,
appreciate you doing this, Brock. I've collected stamps forever. I remember the first one that I got that really interested me was of Mahatma Gandhi, and he was on a stamp. And I
Mhm.
wonder who this guy is, and started research. But I never dug that. I have quite a few of the stamps that you showed today, but I never really went into anywhere the amount of detail that you did in researching them. So I found it very interesting.
Yeah, the history is
Well,
amazing.
It is, and that's what I found out, is that's what I'm going to start doing with my collection now, is looking into some of the history on these, because I didn't know some of the history on these stamps. And I just assumed that the three inverts from the Pan American stamps all were issued, with the mistake. I knew the mistake could occur of turning a sheet upside down, but I didn't realize that third one actually never went on sale to the public. It only got out because, they were given out by this guy to just friends, just as a, hey, here's a unique little thing, have it. He wasn't trying to make any money off of it or anything else. It just was kind of fun. He got that sheet from him, and he said, oh, I'll just pass these out to people. Some of those people probably never, because like I say, that if you look at the numbers, something like 280 some of the 400 stamps that were printed were given away, were released in one way or another. The rest of them were destroyed, but there's less than 200 that they can account for today. So some of those that were given away, the people was like, oh, that's neat, threw it in the trash, or put it on a shelf. Somebody else came across it, didn't know what it was, and it's gone, when the guy passed away. Because they were just given to people, not necessarily collectors. Now the 97 that were put out by the National Museum to trade for stamps they wanted for their collection, those went into collections. Those are there. And there's also, there's a market for stolen stamps. Of the 100 stamps in the Jenny invert, 98 of them, they know where they are. The other two were, well, it was a block of 6 that were stolen back in the, I think it was the 50s or 60s. And over time, 4 of those 6 stamps have shown up. The guy, whoever it was, broke the block down individual stamps, probably had collectors that wanted them in their collection, and he got them for them at a price that, who knows what. But there's still 2 of them unaccounted for. They believe they're out there. It's possible they were destroyed, but they believe they're out there, but they've never shown up again. But the other, they know exactly, if you came up with one, somehow you came across one, it was handed to you and you took it into them, they could tell you exactly where it came from on the sheet, because they photographed that sheet and they know exactly where every stamp was, because again of the perforations varying in width as they went across the sheet and in height as they went across the sheet. Or
Remember
up and down on the sheet.
you remember the movie Brewster's Millions?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he's challenged. You have to spend X amount of money in this period of time, and you can't show anything of worth, and you can't give it away or anything. And they think they've got him, and he goes and he buys a Jenny and mails it, and it would drop the value from whatever $1 million down to next to nothing. So I always thought that was a great plot plan about postmarking a Jenny.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
was it?
Go ahead.
Oh, Breakfast at Tiffany's, wasn't that Cary Grant, and about a stamp collection that they moved the money and to launder it into stamps? Is that, everybody got
Yeah.
the right movie?
I don't know, but you're right. It's one of those that it's a stamp collection that they're using it because the kid got this stamp from a guy at yeah, I think it is breakfast. Is it Tiffin? No.
No, that's the George Papard and
Yeah. No, this
yeah,
is with, who's in this?
Cary
That one
Grant.
is, yeah, Cary Grant. It's one of the Cary Grant ones with, wasn't that, a Hitchcock?
Yes,
No, not,
definitely.
yeah, anyway. But yeah, they use that there. What I was gonna say is in reality, that Jenny stamp might be worth more because it's the only one that's canceled.
yeah, except anybody could get theirs canceled too. So
Well, yeah, that's true if they wanted to do it, but the interesting thing is there are some stamps, US stamps, that when you look at them, you can get a used one or you can get a brand new. These are the really old stamps. You can get a one that's unused. Unused, you can get it for maybe $500. Used, $4,000 because they're harder to find.
yeah,
Because you can't reproduce them today. They have to be canceled with a cancellation from then, not a cancellation today. And that's what makes the Jenny, yes, lose some of its value or lose a lot of its value.
It's not from that era. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, it wasn't, if you had a canceled Jenny from 19, what was it? Did I say 28? I can't remember the year, but if you had one from then with a postmark that actually showed that, that would be worth something because that one was actually used then for postage. Where, yeah, anybody could take a stamp today and do it, but it would be a modern post,
Right.
Right.
cancellation.
So does the postage service have a replacement policy like they do for federal currency? Where
No.
if you have no? Okay.
So if you get your stamps wet and nope, they don't come and say we'll give. Actually,
Partially burned or anything. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think they will go off and do that.
Yeah, I think the difference is because with money, you're given that money. You don't go out and buy the money. The money is given to you in trade for your time, your effort, whatever it is, ways you make your money. And it's put out by the government as legal tender. Postage is not legal tender. You buy stamps, you make the choice to buy that stamp and to put it on an envelope or whatever you want to do with it. So I think that's why money can be replaced if you've got proof that you had it one way or another, either like half the bills are burned away and there's the other half of them or whatever. And stamps, no, because they're not legal tender.
And they don't want people getting them and taking them off an envelope and soaking off the cancellations and that sort of thing. So once it's yours, it's yours.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, cereal box premiums for little toys or whatever would say send 25 cents in stamps or coins.
Right.
And I think that was because when they mailed them, it was what it was going to cost them to mail them back. So they could either use the stamps to mail them back if you gave coins and you were buying it outright and they would just buy the stamps for it. I think that's how they use it, but it wasn't really considered legal tender in the same sense that it is, with money and
Yeah, it was
being
return
able to go out and
postage.
buy a card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they did it as a clever marketing thing. Get a kid to send them 25 cents was a lot easier than getting mom or dad to write a check. Well, again, great. Appreciate you doing this, Brock. And,
Yeah. Thank you so much.
No,
I
you're
see
welcome.
everybody making a run out now to get Lynn stamp news and start adding to their world collections.
Well, and I wanted to remind you, remember I told you guys about how I found that Lennon book that ended in 1907 of a stamp collection. And yeah, and I mean, I'm always really curious about what those stamps could be worth.
Well, if they go back, I mean, even from 1907 back, that's a time period that those stamps just have, no matter almost to some degree what shape they're in, even if they're used versus new, they're going to be worth, a fairly decent amount of money.
Neat.
I had somebody recently they had somebody brought in their collection and they had envelopes full of stamps that they didn't use in their collection because they already had them, but they were collecting them. But they were all stamps from the 50s and 60s. And it's like I said, these stamps are pennies. They put them in a. I said, just if you've got somebody that's into stamp collecting, but they thought, is there anything worth anything in here? It's like, no, this is just
Yeah.
junk. But you go back in time to those time periods, and you get stuff like that. Wow, that could be worth money.
Well, I seem to recall like Boys Life magazine and different comics that you got like Superman and all would always have those little ads in the back for send us $1 and we'll send you like 1,000 stamps from
Yeah,
around the world or 1,000 US stamps or whatever.
yeah, and those were
And they're all still worth nothing, I guess. And there was a TV show where a guy does these auctions. I can't think of his name, but somebody gave all their stamps to the Boy Scouts, as it was going to be this big donation. And they had these experts come in and he says, there's not a stamp in this pile worth a penny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I collected them, I'm sure like you, Brock, because of the interest in them. I've told people collecting stamps or comic books or anything like that, if you're trying to make
Merit
money,
badges.
you're going to go down, yeah, or Disney records. You're
Yeah.
going to end up losing money on the deal, particularly because nobody collects anything anymore, but I mean, like I said, as a kid, I found it. It's funny. I was just talking to Carol yesterday. She went to there was a online talk about Marc Chagall, the artist, and I mentioned that the United Nations had come up with a set of stamps on Chagall stained glass windows, and when I saw those, that launched my whole interest in collecting United Nations stamps. So like I said, the history on some of these things is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I got the bug because as a kid, I loved old sailing ships, square rigged sailing ships,
Huh.
like the USS Constitution or just any sailing ship. And when back in the, I think this was in the 60s, the United States built the US ship Savannah, which was the first nuclear powered cargo ship. And it was sailing, did a lot of sailing to different ports, both in the United States and around the world, as a thing to promote this whole concept. And it came into LA Harbor. And so my dad said, let's go down and see this nuclear. It's the first nuclear powered, commercial ship. And so we went down there and toured it. And while you were on board, they had a few little things you could buy for souvenirs to take back, of which one was they had postage stamps, and the US had put out a postage stamp of the USS Savannah, which was the first ocean going steam powered vessel, I think, that the United States built. But it still had, because they didn't know how much they could rely on or how long their fuel would last. It was a square rigged ship that they had just refitted with paddle wheels and a steam boiler on it. And so here was this square rib ship on a stamp, and it was like, ooh, this is really neat. I didn't know they put ships on stamps. So that's what got me into collecting stamps. I wanted to find out more about, well, what other stamps are out there and what do they have? And as a result, I have a sheet of that stamp that's in my sheet collection. And it's the very first one you come across because that's what got me into collecting. So,
Neat.
different things will bring you into different stuff.
Yeah, my Uncle Steve, the same guy that got me into photography. God, when I think about what Uncle Steve has cost me over the years. But he was a huge stamp collector, and I expressed some interest, and the next thing I know, I was getting flooded with stamps. And every now and then I would mention that I have every one of that definitive collection except the 2.5 cent stamp. And at Thanksgiving, my plate at the table to be an envelope with a 2.5 cent stamp in it.
Wow.
Yeah, he did some wonderful things over the years to fill in the holes in my collection.
Neat.
Well, again, thanks much. Next week, we're going back to the world of films and videos. I just finished restoring some stuff and had some fun with things. So we have the 64 fair coming up. If you, again, are interested in the 39 fair, I did a 2-hour talk this past Tuesday. I'm doing part 2 of it. this Tuesday, and it will have the major industrial pavilions of the 39-40 fair. It will have the changes that took place between 39 and 40. And we're also going to have hopefully a fun little segment on the crazy, weird, wacky things that how on earth anybody thought that would make a good exhibit at that particular fair. So
Cool.
again, appreciate folks joining us. And again, Brock, you have my sincere thanks. I know you put a lot of effort into it.
Oh,
People have no idea when the amount of changes from the first presentation and now, how we upgraded the number of pictures and everything. So again, a big cheer for putting all the effort in there, sir.
Well,
Yeah.
you're welcome.
It was really
Happy to
fun
do it.
having the exposition posters ahead of the stamps. That was
Yeah,
neat.
that was something I started to add near the end, and finding some of them, like a couple of them, it was really difficult because there wasn't much out there for that.
Yeah.
And so one of them is actually made up of a postcard and 2 emblems that they used for that fair, because I could find nothing as poster wise on the internet.
I just know I'm going to release the picture of the Palace of Fine Arts stamp out into the wild and see what frenzy it causes people to collect it.
Yeah.
Great. We'll see you
Yeah.
folks next week then. Thanks much.
We'll visit you in prison, Bill.
thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bob. Go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.